On October 1st, 2019, Luis Garcia was senselessly shot in the back of his head and killed by this man, Brandon Castiglione. If that sounds simple to you to say it that way, it's because it is simple. This is not a case of some complicated mystery where we're trying to figure out who killed Luis. The defendant did it, and the evidence you'll hear throughout this trial will prove it. One bullet, one casing, one pistol, and one man, Brandon Castiglione. And this is slide 7. All found within feet of Luis's body, in the room directly next to the defendant's bedroom, and in the hall just outside that room. That's the room where Luis had been doing some sanding and painting for the defendant's father, Mark, in their home at 15 Ridgemont Drive in Londonderry, New Hampshire. Now, you're not going to hear evidence from the state in this case about why Brandon shot and killed Luis Garcia. The fact of the matter is, not every act can be explained, especially one so senseless. But as the judge will explain to you later, motive is not an element of the crime of second-degree murder. You will, however, hear evidence showing that the one bullet and one casing were the same make and manufacture as an ammunition box kept in the defendant's bedside drawer, and that one pistol found just outside the room, a Glock 19 9mm, was the defendant's. And he kept that pistol, he kept his Glock 19 in its case, in the drawer, right next to his bed. You're going to hear in this trial that the defendant and Mr. Garcia met through their church, New England Pentecostal, in Pelham, New Hampshire. Their families also met through that church, and they met about a year and a half before the defendant shot and killed Luis. In the weeks leading up to October 1st of 2019, Luis was working, as I said, in the defendant's home in Londonderry. That's a home that's owned by Mark Castiglione, the defendant's father. And the defendant and his dad were the only two people living in that home at the time. Luis had spent about 2 or 3 weeks before that day going room to room, doing small repairs and renovations for Mark. He had stripped wallpaper, sanded, and painted some rooms. And on that day, he was working in the last bedroom on the left down the hallway. He was sanding and painting. It was a room that Mark had turned into an office, and at the time, all of the furniture had been moved to the center of the room and was covered with a painter's tarp. Now, during those 2 or 3 weeks, you'll hear, as we expect you'll hear, from Mark Castiglione himself, that he would leave for work around 6 a.m. every workday. And he'd travel to Billerica, Mass., where his job was, and he'd stay there until he came home in the afternoon or evening. Luis, as you'll hear, would leave his house in Manchester around 8 a.m. every day. And he'd travel to Londonderry about 20 or 25 minutes to the Castiglione residence. And he'd stay there while he worked on whatever project he was working on. For the rest of the day after Luis would arrive, it would be him and the defendant inside that home. You're going to hear that on days that Luis was working in that house, Mark Castiglione would regularly call him on his first break of the day at 9:30. He'd call him to check in on progress that he was making, to see what room he was working on that day. And as Mark would put it, Luis answered those calls consistently. But that changed on October 1st, 2019. Because on that morning, Luis did not answer Mark's calls. Through the trial, you'll see and hear evidence that Mark didn't just call at 9:30. He called again at 11:42 and again at 12:14. Each time without an answer from Luis. You're also going to hear and see evidence that Mark would call his son, the defendant, each time he tried calling Luis. But each time, the defendant also would not answer his phone. So Mark eventually got in touch with his daughter, Danielle Padalano. And Danielle in turn got in touch with Frances Pastana, or Fran. Now Frances and Luis and his wife Patty had lived with Fran and Jeff for a short time after they moved to New Hampshire from Massachusetts. So Frances tried calling Luis's phone. Frances tried calling Patty, Luis's wife. And then Patty tried calling Luis. Nobody could get in touch with him. I thought this was odd or concerning, as you'll hear, that no one could reach Luis. So Danielle, the defendant's sister, and Fran, his grandmother, finally decided to go to 15 Ridgemont Drive, where they knew, and where Mark knew, and where Patty knew, that Luis was supposed to be that day. And that's where the defendant was as well. You're going to hear that when they got there, Luis's car was in the driveway, but the house was locked up. Fran and Danielle's yelling and calling into the house went unanswered. Danielle tried the front door, she tried the back door. Like I said, they tried yelling, and they tried throwing acorns or pebbles at the windows of the house, including this top left corner. That window is where they saw a light on. And Danielle recognized that as her old bedroom, the last room on the left at the end of the hall. Despite all their efforts, still nothing from inside, no response. So Danielle, concerned for her brother and for Luis, called her dad, Mark, and Mark told her about the key he had been leaving for Luis under the front mat. He'd left it so Luis could get into the house early in the morning when Brandon would still be sleeping. She found the key right where Mark kept it. She unlocked the door and went inside. She went up the stairs. She went down the hall to the left, toward her old bedroom at the end of the hall. This doorway on the left here. And that was the room where Luis had been working that morning. Like I said, that office furniture was moved to the center of the room. You're going to hear that when Danielle got to that room, she found her brother, the defendant, just inside the door. He was on his hands and knees, and he was mumbling, but words she couldn't quite understand. He was unharmed and uninjured. Luis Garcia, on the other hand, trapped between the furniture and the wall he had just been sanding. Danielle ran back outside to her grandmother and told her what she had seen, and then Fran went inside. And Fran found the defendant in that same room, her grandson, right where Danielle had seen him, and then she made her way around that furniture. She saw him lying on the floor, blood pooling around his head and surrounding him. The two women called 911 immediately, and Londonderry officers went to the house. When they entered the house, they saw several crucial things. First was at the end of this hallway, that pistol on top of that plastic set of drawers. And then slide 17, inside the room, they found the defendant in this area here, just feet away from Luis. You'll hear that they found a bullet casing between the two men. They found a bullet between the two men. One bullet, one casing, one pistol, one killer in the room with Luis. Now that bullet and the casing were sent to the New Hampshire State Laboratory, where they were analyzed by criminalist Jill Terrio, an expert from whom you'll hear that both the casing and the bullet were linked to that gun found in the hallway, the defendant's gun. The Glock 19 9mm, serial number TSA 446. She'll also explain to you that the casing and the bullet were 9mm solid copper hollow point. marketed by a brand called Fiachi. The pistol was also sent to the New Hampshire State Laboratory, where it was analyzed for fingerprints by criminalist Rachel Martinez. You'll hear from her that the only fingerprint found on that gun was Brandon Castiglione's. You'll also hear throughout this trial that when New Hampshire State Police investigators got on the scene, in the house, they found that the doors, other than the front door, which Danielle had opened, were locked. The windows were shut. There was property inside, items in front of the windows, obstructing them. They found no indication that anyone had entered that house other than Luis Garcia when he got there that morning, and Danielle Padalano when she unlocked the door, and Fran when she followed. You're going to hear from Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Jenny Duval, who did an autopsy on Luis's body. She's going to explain to you that Mr. Garcia, Luis, was shot from behind, that the bullet entered the right base of his skull and exited the left front of his neck. The shot was not self-inflicted, and that it was from fairly close range. She'll also tell you about the untold damage that bullet caused Luis's spinal cord. It caused him to immediately collapse and bleed out on the floor of that room, where the defendant and his bullet and his casing were found with him. His gun just outside the door. The reason why the defendant shot and killed Luis Garcia, the fact remains that he did. And the law governing the defendant's actions is clear. By demonstrating that the defendant, with the requisite criminal intent, there are no independent eyewitnesses to exactly what the defendant said or what he was thinking when he pulled that trigger. The injuries he caused show his criminal intent and the act. Judge Ruoff will later instruct you that the law criminalizes the murder, regardless of the motive for his criminal intent or the act. So one bullet and one casing, the defendant's. One pistol, the defendant's, with his fingerprint on it. And one man, one killer, the defendant found in the room with Luis Garcia, having been inside that house when it was locked during that day. He was found feet away from Luis, having not called 911, having not answered his phone, having not answered his family members' calls from outside the house. While it may not make sense, this man shot and killed a husband, father, grandfather, and just man, with his gun and his bullet. Guilty of sex. Okay.